Hey there, welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. We're going to be continuing our series on The Question, and today we're going to be looking at issue 15, which is Epitaph for a Hero. If you saw my last video, you saw me gushing over the last two issues because I love those issues. There was a bunch of ideas that I really got to sink my teeth into, and I was excited about that. That's really why I love talking about The Question, is because I love talking about ideas, philosophical ideas, and this issue is no different. There's a good amount that I'm gonna get to talk about, and so I'm excited about that, and so let's go ahead and get right into it. So the issue opens up with this Harvey Bullock looking gentleman right here, and this guy's name is Loomis McCarthy, and he is a private investigator. Now he's in Hub City investigating a series of murders, and the murders have nothing that link them that link the victims, except that each of the victims is an black man, and Loomis is there investigating these murders, and it's very quickly revealed that Loomis is a racist, bone deep, hardcore racist, and we'll find out, you know, how racist as the issue progresses. But like right from the onset, we find out that he's a racist, and because he starts making light of the victim who has been hanged, and he does this right in front of a black police officer who starts, you know, calling him out on doing this, and Loomis goes so far as to call the dude the N-word, and Denny O'Neil, the writer, chooses to use that word, no asterisks, nothing, just straight up uses the word. And I wanted to take a second to discuss that because I feel like in modern comics today, there is no chance that that word would get by the editors. There is no way. But Denny O'Neil, he uses it. And so I kind of wanted to discuss, you know, whether or not I think that's a good or bad thing. Before I do, I have to make the disclaimer for those who need this sort of a disclaimer. I do not like that word. I would never use that word. I have no interest in ever using that word. It's a bad word. It has obviously really horrible historical connotations. And so, that being said, I think it's a terrible word, right? And yeah. I think that that's enough. Now, let's talk about Denny O'Neil using the word. Is it good or bad that Denny O'Neil used the word? I think that Denny O'Neil makes a very brave choice. He's trying to create a character who is a racist, and so he makes him as realistically racist as possible. And I think that there's a school of thought nowadays that essentially we should be shielded from real life evil in our fiction, that our fiction should essentially like paint a purely fantastical world, a purely escapist world. And you know, I think that there so let me start by saying this. I think there's a place for escapist fiction, so that's fine. There's nothing wrong with escapist fiction. I think that the problem is when all fiction becomes escapist fiction, and we can't do anything that is more grounded in the real world. And I think that that's a problem because I think that there's benefits to having a mirror put up against society and seeing the dark blotches in the mirror, because the reality is, number one, society's full of all kinds of different evils, and number two, more than likely, you and I are full of all kinds of different evils, and I think that that's something that's really good for us to be confronted with, because I think it's the only way that we can grow out of our naivety. I think only a child needs to be protected from the realities of the world, because once you become an adult, life is just a series of harsh realities of being confronted with the harshness of life. And I understand the argument, and it's why I said I think that there's a place for escapist fiction. I understand the argument of, hey, when I read a comic or when I watch a movie or whatever, I just want to escape from the harsh realities of the world. And hey, again, that's fine. I don't have any problem with escapist fiction. But when all fiction is escapist, I tend to think that, number one, it's boring. Number two, I think that there's only so many escapist stories that you can read or ingest before you've kind of gotten the full gamut of escapist stories. You know what I mean? Like there's only so many escapist stories that can be told, right? But real life, there's all kinds of stories that can be told in real life, because real life is always going on and there's always new things happening in real life. And so I think that it's necessary to have stories where very realistic evil people are portrayed, to make sure that we don't end up those very realistic evil people. Now, what Denny does with this evil person is really interesting at the end of the book, but I'm going to get to that when I get to that. All right? So let's keep going with the story. So Loomis ends up meeting Vic Sage, who doesn't immediately recognize that this guy's a racist because he didn't hear the racist comments. And so Vic Sage talks to the guy, and they end up agreeing to share information with each other. Since Vic Sage is a reporter, this guy's a private eye, it makes sense, right, for them to exchange information and see if they can get to the bottom of the murders. So Vic Sage agrees to that, but then as they're departing from each other, Loomis decides to tell a racist joke about how I honestly don't even want to repeat the joke, but basically it's a racist joke about black people being killed, right? So this guy's a real class act. Anyways, so Vic goes to the news station and he reports on the murders, and after his bit of the news is concluded, we are told by his co-anchor that there is a new person who is going to be running for mayor against Myra. And this person's name is, I have it here in my notes, is Royal Dinsmore. And so Royal Dinsmore is pretty much, he's also a racist. He's very much your prototypical, how do I want to say, 1980s conservative through the lens of liberal like Denny O'Neil. Yeah, he's basically just somebody that, is a thorough going capitalist who thinks that, minorities are destroying America and, whatever, right? So that's essentially who is running up against Myra. And Vic and the station manager comment on how the guy's a jerk. So we all know how we're supposed to feel about this guy, right? And so from there, Vic ends up going to visit the private eye Loomis at a lounge. And while they're talking, it becomes pretty obvious that the guy's a racist. And so Vic doesn't really want to keep talking to him. And so he goes to leave, but right before he goes to leave, Loomis tries to pay the tab, and his keys fall out of his pocket, and Vic sees the keys, and he sees the room number on the keys, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to go and check on this guy, because, maybe he has something to do with the murders, right? So he dresses up as the Question, and he goes into the guy's room, and he starts looking through the guy's stuff, and he ends up finding some like white nationalist type magazines, some like bondage pornography, and finally a day planner. You know how you arrange those things in your hotel, right? The white nationalist magazine, then the hardcore bondage pornography, and then your day planner right next to it, right? And so the Question finds the day planner, and written in the day planner is a guy's name, Caleb Phillips. And the Question reveals to us through caption boxes that Caleb Phillips is the head of some sort of like KKK type organization. And so now we know that Loomis, like, he's not just a racist, like he's like a, like he commits to the bit. Right? Like, he's all the way in, he's not just dabbling with some racism. He's all the way in. He's he's a, you know, he's a white nationalist. He's in the KKK, and so this dude is very obviously a scumbag extraordinaire. And so as the question is looking through this guy's room, all of a sudden some guy comes into the room. He has a mask on, and he starts shooting at the question. And so the question dodges the bullets using his martial arts, and eventually he ends up getting to the guy and disarming him. He takes his gun, and then he takes the guy's mask off. It turns out the guy is a black man, so we don't know, you know, what it is that he's there to do. And just as the question is about to interrogate him, because of the fact that there were gunshots going off, some of the people in the room next door come over to, you know, see what's going on, and they see the question with a mask, you know, about to beat up some guy on his knees, and they all think that the question is the bad guy, and so they all rush the question to try and attack him. And so the question, very proud of these citizens. I love that he gives them like kudos as he's trying to escape from them. You know, he's very proud of the fact that they would come and assist an unarmed man from a masked bandit. And so he, you know, he does his best to not injure them as he escapes, and so he jumps out the window before he gets to question the guy that was shooting at him. So he goes home to Todd's house where he lives, and he and Todd end up talking about what's going on, and Vic talks about how he doesn't like Loomis and how Loomis is a racist and all of that, right? And so Vic, doing his due diligence in investigating who the murderer was, pulls up the police database back in the 80s on, you know, 80s computers, and he looks up the registration of the gun. And it turns out that the gun had been reported stolen earlier that day by a guy named, let's see here, John Figlia. And so John Figlia is the original owner of the gun, and he owns a number of other guns. And the question, or Vic, looks at his address and his phone number and everything like that, and he intends to go and talk to him, but before he can, a call comes in that there's been another murder. And so Vic goes to the scene of the crime, and when he gets there, Loomis is already there, and it turns out it's a black man who's been roped up to a tree, and Loomis, like the class act that he is, starts making jokes about it in front of the same black police officer that he had made jokes in front of before. And the black police officer finally gives him what's coming to him, which is a good old sock to the face. And Loomis, and then after that, he starts kicking the guy when he's down. This guy deserves it. It's all good. And so he has to get held back by one of his by his partner. And then Loomis actually gets up like and starts yelling at Vic like, "Oh, why didn't you help me? Why didn't you help me?" And Vic ends up telling him, you know, this dude saved me the trouble. I would have probably ended up doing it myself if he hadn't done it first. And then Loomis is like, "Oh, you know, you love black people. There's nothing worse than a white man who loves black people. You're a traitor to your race," all that kind of good stuff. And so from there, Vic goes back home. He's like practicing martial arts. He's like kicking a punching bag, and he starts talking to Todd again about how Loomis is a racist. And at this point, he's fairly convinced that Loomis must be the guy that is behind all these murders, because he's a bone deep racist. He's part of the KKK. He's into bondage, pornography, and all of that. He's obviously sick in the head. And so Vic kind of puts all the puzzle pieces together and says, "Look, it seems to me the most likely scenario is that this guy's the killer." He shows up in town, you know, right around the time that the murders start. You know, it seems like this guy's the killer. And so Aristotle actually is kind of like, you know, chill out on that. You know, you don't know for sure. And Vic's like, I don't, but the evidence seems to point in that direction. I'm going to tail this guy as the question, right? So he dons his question attire. He starts following Loomis around, and he follows Loomis to a house. And the house, it turns out, is owned by John Figlia, the guy that owned the gun from the assailant that had attacked the question earlier, right? In Loomis's room. And so the question recognizes the house because he remembers the address from the police databanks. And so he goes in to the house, and he goes up to a door, and he hears that Loomis is talking to somebody inside of the room, and so he stays outside of the door. And so Loomis is talking to John Figlia, and Loomis ends up doing a Sherlock Holmes on us. He explains the whole situation, what went on. So it turns out that John Figlia was once friends and business partners with that guy that's running for mayor now, Royal Dinsmore. And Royal Dinsmore actually betrayed him in a business deal. And so what this guy has been doing is he's had that hitman, that black guy that attacked the question, actually attacking black men. And then eventually he was going to pin all the crimes on Royal Dinsmore to sabotage his mayoral campaign. And we find out that Figlia, after his situation, after the business deal with Dinsmore went bad, he actually ended up in a mental institution, and that's where he met the gunman, the guy that had attacked the question. And so Loomis actually explains all this to the guy. He's like, look, I got you. And so the guy's like, oh, you don't really have any evidence. And he's like, yeah, well, honestly, I'm not really here to take you in or anything. I'm really happy about the fact that you killed all those black people. I'm really just here because the head of the KKK that I work for, he heard about all these black people getting killed. He thought maybe, that it was somebody that was associated with us, and he kind of wanted to open up communications with the guy. But now that I find out that you're doing it just to pin it on this other guy, ultimately, my time here was useless. There was no reason for me to be here, and I'm not going to turn you in. So it's all good. Let's part ways. But before he can leave, the gunman from that had attacked the question earlier suddenly comes up on Loomis, starts attacking him from behind. And the question, who's listening on the other side of the door, hears the struggling. He busts into the room just in time to see Loomis pull out his gun, point it behind himself, and shoot the gunman in self-defense. And so the question is like, well, essentially, there's nothing left for me to do here. And so he changes back into Vic Sage so that he can report as Vic Sage everything that he heard as the question. And so he goes back to his news report, or back to the news station, and he prepares to do that, right? And so he essentially tells the whole story that Loomis told to Figlia and on the newscast. And this enrages Figlia, who ends up going to the news station in order to kill Vic Sage. All right. And so this is going to set up the final scenario here that I said that I wanted to discuss. So what happens is Loomis, before he leaves town, decides to come by and see Vic and actually apologize to him for insulting him about loving black people. And in his sick head, he's like, I know why you didn't defend me against that black guy. It's because you knew that I could take, that there was no chance that some black guy was going to take me unless he caught me by surprise. And so Vic gets his chance to kind of moralize to the guy and give him the "you're a disgusting racist" speech to the guy, which again the guy deserves. And then that's what leads up to the final scenario where Figlia shows up with his gun to kill Vic. He goes to shoot Vic, and Loomis jumps in the way of the bullet and takes a bullet for Vic. And Vic, he can't believe it. He's horrified by the fact that this bone-deep racist has just given his life for him. and he can't abide it. It's deplorable to his soul, you know, this guy that he felt all this venom towards, that he hated, and that he thought was, you know, like the embodiment of scum, gave his life for Vic. And so Vic ends up punching out Figlia, just, you know, so that we can get that guy out of the way, so that we can talk about how the issue ends, which is one of the ladies that's at the news station ends up calling Loomis a hero because he sacrificed his life for Vic, and Vic's like, don't you dare call this guy a hero. And she's like, well, what is he? You know, he gave his life up for you. And Vic says these last lines right here: I don't know, maybe there are no heroes and no villains either. Maybe there's not one damn villain in the world. Now I'm gonna say it's a little over dramatic that he's crying. I feel like Denny went one step past where he needed to go. Like, Vic didn't need to be crying. But the point that Denny is making there is a point that I think all writers should take to heart, which is any person can do something heroic. And there are all kinds of really horrible people that have done heroic things over the course of time throughout human history. And the idea that Denny's getting at there is, you know, there are no heroes, there are no villains. I would go the opposite way, actually, on that I think inside of every villain there can be a hero. Because as I've said before, I think all of us have the capacity for both good and evil. And I think that that's really how we should view one another as human beings, that we all have the capacity for both good and evil. And because of the fact that some people maybe lean a little bit more towards the evil side, and some of us, I say us, hoping that I fall into that category, some of us hopefully fall into more of the good side, right? That doesn't give anybody the right to condemn somebody else as a purely evil person. I mean, there are obvious examples: Hitler, Stalin, Mao, those kinds of guys that, like, essentially, you know, lay waste to societies and kill millions and millions of people. Let's reserve you're evil for people like that, right? For everyone else, let's assume that most of us are trying to operate within this spectrum here, and probably most of us don't fall as close to the good side as we wish that we would, and maybe we can have some mercy on one another, and recognize that there's good in all people. And I said before that this is something that all writers should learn from. It's really easy when you're writing to take the people that you don't like and just make them into cartoon villains without three-dimensional thoughts, without reasons for the things that they do or believe. That's not how you tell a good story. The way that you tell a good story is how Denny told the story, which is he took somebody that is very obviously somebody that Denny doesn't like. If you've ever listened to interviews with Denny, Denny does not like racists. But he took somebody that he doesn't like, and he made him do something heroic. And I think that that's something that writers are supposed to do, because writing is all about putting yourself in the mind space of people who are not like you. And that's how a writer learns as he's writing, he or she is writing. And that's how a reader learns about different perspectives. And that's supposed to be the point of literature, is to teach us different perspectives, to teach us to think like one another. For all of the talk that we have in today's society about empathy, that's how you gain empathy, is by thinking like other people, especially people who you disagree with. That's the whole point of empathy, is to think like someone that doesn't think like you. And the reality is, All of us have different temperaments. All of us have different experiences. That racist dude is probably a racist for a reason. I don't think that there's any good reason to be a racist. But maybe if you could understand why he's a racist, you could convince him to stop being a racist. That's how that, I forget the guy's name, but that guy that goes into the KKK and like befriends, he's a black guy that befriends KKK members and then draws them out of white supremacy. Like, isn't that like, isn't that what we should all be striving to be? Somebody like that, that's drawing people out of the darkness and into the light, versus standing in the light and castigating all of those in the darkness. How are we going to build a better world if there's a group of us that are the light, and we don't draw anybody out of the darkness? And so that's what I take out of that story. And it's part of the reason why I love Denny so much, because I love ultimately where he's coming from. And even though Denny and I disagree about certain things, I love Denny with all my heart. And so I also love you for watching this video all the way through. I appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.